Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
The war between Russia and Ukraine is one of the worst in the 21st century. The other two being Afghanistan in the first 2 decades, as well as Iraq. All three have in common the United States led Western coalition behind these wars. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, it is indeed a proxy war because Ukraine, left to its own devices, would not be able to stand up to Russia. According to even President Trump, who said as much to the Ukrainian President Zelensky, that it is simply an asymmetrical military relationship. Russia has the world's most nuclear warheads, and building more as a new arms race is in its embryonic stage right now, with both the United States and Russia announcing possibility of testing nuclear warheads. Now, the idea that the war in between Russia and Ukraine, on the side of the of Ukraine and its allies, its Western allies, Europeans and the United States, is, well, to make sure that authoritarian Russia does not expand and roll into Europe. Next thing you know, they will be occupying Paris and Rome. And to save Western democracy and Western civilization. Interestingly enough, the government of Israel argued that its war against the Palestinian people was indeed a war to save and sustain Western civilization against Palestinian Muslims. Although, of course, international organizations, the International Criminal Court, International Criminal Court of Justice, the United Nations, other governments around the world, I should say, and international human rights organizations have concluded that the war in Israel, behind which is also the United States and the West, is a war of genocide. Yet it's about civilization. This is not to say that the other side, that the side of Russia and its supporters, primarily China, are on the side of the angels. This is not a contest between the evil versus good dichotomy that we have been used to from the Cold War to the present, one side painting the other as evil. This is about the war between Russia and Ukraine, is about geopolitical advantages leading to tangible economic benefits for their respective businesses, large companies of other side, and as well as in the case of China and Russia, state-owned companies. So this is not anything, has nothing to do anything about democracy. It has nothing to do about freedom. It has nothing to do about the idea of somehow saving Western civilization from the evil Russian bear. The idea is laughable because the United States and the Western European countries are nuclear powered. Russia would self-destruct if it opts for the nuclear option. It would in fact invite what back in the Kennedy administration was deemed to be the mad doctrine, namely mutually assured destruction. That's not in the cards. This is about the using Ukraine, both Russia and the West, by the way, are using the Ukraine and behind Russia, China, to make sure that the world balance of power is determined and the benefits that would accrue, as I stated, to economic interest, the corporate business interest of the two respective sides. This is about that kind of power struggle to see whether the emerging China-led BRICS group, which Russia is a major partner, would prevail and reshape, as Xi Jinping, the president of China, has stated very clearly and publicly and repeatedly, reshape the world balance of power and create a new world order versus the unipolar world order of George Herbert Walker Bush of 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. When the Soviet Union did collapse, there were 16 NATO members, by the way. 16 NATO members. Today, in 2025, there are 32, double. So what you have is, although there is no Warsaw Pact, the counterpart during the Cold War to NATO, created during the Eisenhower era, and the Warsaw Pact having its genesis in the Stalin, but then Khrushchev, of course, laid the foundation, created the Warsaw Pact. I believe in the mid-50s it was. So what we have is an expanded NATO, which has plainly stated that it has every right to go beyond the North Atlantic Treaty Organization boundaries. That's what NATO stands for, the initials NATO. To in fact become a global security organization. Ukraine plays a major role, although the government of Russia during the Yeltsin era in the 1990s was assured that there would not be NATO expansion to threaten the security zone around the Russian Federation as it exists today after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the creation of new republics all around the Federation. Although they were assured, the fact is that the West is not adhering to that promise. NATO wants to expand using Ukraine as an economically and militarily integrated member of NATO, of the West, the Western Alliance, and the European Union, to become integrated with the European Union, and of course to use Ukraine as a stepping stone to the Black Sea, historically, of course, the Russian lake, and from there to the Transcaucasus region and into Central Asia, and set foothold through military, geopolitical, that is, strategic integration of the Transcaucasus and Central Asia, and economic integration, thereby containing the excess of evil countries, which, of course, according to many Westerners, especially neocons and neoconservatives in Europe and the United States, include Russia, North Korea, Iran, by the way, right there in the mix, and China. The big, obviously, the big power here behind all of those excess of evil countries is China. Now, the fact is that the way things have evolved in almost 4 years, in February 2026, it will be 4 years of war between Russia and Ukraine, with devastating losses in terms of casualties, injured, especially displaced population of Ukraine, estimated between 20 and 35%, scattered all around Europe. all of this suffering, not to mention the derivative effects of the war in the global economy, with the global south suffering the worst of those effects. And in terms of, if we look at this class based, as many scholars have pointed out, the people who have paid the price for this war, one of the worst wars, along with Afghanistan, Iraq. By the way, some people include the Syrian civil war, behind also which was, of course, um, trying to overthrow the Assad regime, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, European countries. That was one of the bloodiest in the 20th century. Also, the civil war down in Yemen, the same thing. However, in terms of conventional wars, Iraq, the invasion of Iraq by US led forces, Western forces, Afghanistan, and this one here, Ukraine and Russia. Like I said, it is no secret that Ukraine could not possibly stand up to Russia. In terms of military strength, it would have collapsed long ago, were it not for approximately half a trillion estimated, it could be more, that it has received in aid to keep this war going. Now, the Europeans have been complaining that they have been marginalized all along, and it had been hoped just recently. In fact, on November 5th, the government in Washington, Trump announced that it would not attend the G20 meeting in South Africa because the Trump administration has accused South Africa of committing crimes against Afrikaners. These are the people who were for decades carrying out apartheid policies in South Africa against the black majority of 80% of the population, by the way. And so he decided not to go. The Europeans were there is some press coverage on this, wanted Trump to go because he had, there was some hope that he would discuss the issue of ending the Ukraine war. It is no secret that in this war, obviously, the big hit has been taken first and foremost above all other countries in the world by Ukraine, then by Russia, the other country, the other party involved in this war. And there's no doubt that obviously Russia is the one who launched the war for reasons that are valid according to the Kremlin, not valid according to the West, and that is security reasons, that creating a NATO member while also economically integrating into the EU, the European Union, right on the border, a major country like Ukraine, by the way, right on the border of Russia, destabilized Russia, and they did not want that. Ideally, obviously, the Kremlin wanted a pro-Moscow regime. Ideally, the West wanted to make sure that it maintains a pro-West regime that is essentially a satellite of the West, serves as a periphery country like other Eastern European countries that cater to Western geopolitical and geoeconomic interests. That was the role of Ukraine, and also as a stepping stone for NATO expansion. So NATO expansion was the longer term goal into, like I said, Transcaucasus and through Central Asia. NATO made it clear that it recognizes no limits on this planet where it wishes to expand. Now, it's interesting that in the course of the evolution of this war, both sides recognized that they had, with the exception of Ukraine, by the way, that they had some interest that they did not realize at the beginning of the war. One thing, by the way, historically, when you study the history of wars, what you find is that there is always the enthusiasm that on the parties carrying out the war that we'll get this over with in a few weeks. They said the same thing about World War One, by the way. It lasted 4 years. So it's going to be short-term conflict, short-term conflict. Afghanistan lasted 20 years. So the idea that there's upfront there is this delusion of a quick fix through a military solution, discounting the diplomatic route to solving the conflict. Major mistake. This is not to say, by the way, that Russia is excluded from this. Russia is not excluded from this. On the contrary, Russia could have more vigorously pursued a diplomatic solution to this using the leverage of China and BRICS, but it chose the military solution. So both sides choosing the military solution, what did they discover in the last almost 4 years, minus 4 months almost until before it reaches the 4-year mark? They realized that this war had benefits for their respective companies, and it's not just the defense sector, by the way, but a number of other companies from high tech to supply companies supplying everything from clothing to foodstuffs and so forth. And as obviously what is the case in all wars. In all wars, there are companies that benefit, that profit from this. And the United Nations has issued a specific report just for Israel with a list of companies profiting, unfortunately, from that war that Israel launched in Gaza. So there is that reality. When you look at the Russian GDP, the fact is that despite the switching to a war economy, it has stood up fairly well. Now, why is that? Because behind Russia stands China. And China has benefited even more than Russia. In fact, if there is a number one beneficiary as a result of this war, it is not Russia on the other side, on the Russia alliance group, which includes a lot of the global South countries. It includes India, by the way, Brazil. It is really China. China is the major beneficiary of this. And it is no secret that the Chinese have been saying, the president, including the president of China, Chairman Xi Jinping, has said, we want a diplomatic solution to this. However, the diplomatic solution has not been forthcoming. And all along, China has benefited, and Russia has managed, finally, after pushing for years, it has been pushing for a Siberian gas pipeline to go down to China and to go to the east toward China. And finally, Xi Jinping agreed to that. So there is a much deeper integration of Russia with China, thereby changing the global balance of power even more in the process of the Ukrainian war. Because of the Ukrainian war, this would not have happened had there been a diplomatic solution. We don't know what would have happened, let's be honest. But the fact is that the West, the US-led West in this proxy war, has pushed Russia into the embrace of China, made Russia much more economically dependent on China. And China has made it very clear that it has so much in terms of vested interest in Russia in this conflict in Ukraine that it will not accept a military solution with the West winning. Meaning, Putin has the green light to push the button if he's pushed to the wall. So the idea that China will not, and for obvious reasons, why would China accept a Western military solution, a military victory in Ukraine when Xi Jinping and the group, the Communist Party of China, knows what that means. It means unchecked NATO expansion, containment of China, problems in the South China Sea and Taiwan. China is next, in other words, for this. And considering, by the way, the uh, uh, the United States forever war doctrine, that it is committed to this, even with Trump, as we'll see, who during in 2024 during the campaign season, he was saying, well, we'll end all these wars. The Democrats are war lovers. We'll put an end to this, including, of course, this Ukrainian war. We'll end it in a day. This is November 2025. Trump was sworn in January 2025. And not only is there no end in sight, the United States, as I already briefly mentioned, and Russia have made noise about testing new weapons, nuclear weapons, to essentially use as deterrence on the other side. So they each are using this to deter the other side. Now, in 2024, the Europeans, who are among the big losers in this war, along with the Ukrainians, in my view, the European people, by the way, not the European businesses that have made money out of this, European governments accuse China of complicity in the Ukrainian war. They have accused, of course, North Korea, Iran, the axis of evil countries. But China is obviously an economic superpower, the economic superpower of the world, and it's heavily integrated in the world economy. So it carries a different weight when the European Union accuses China of complicity in the Ukrainian war, and essentially saying they're hypocrites calling for a diplomatic solution when they're complicit in seeking a military solution, is what essentially the Europeans were saying. China, for its part, of course, lays the blame with the West and its policy of using the defense sector in perpetual destabilization. Despite the Cold War ending 35 years ago, destabilization is a policy that is chronic with the US-led Western Bloc alliance, the NATO alliance. And it's not just in the Middle East, it's in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, it's in Latin America, with the United States gunning down vessels in the Caribbean, accused, of course, carrying narco trafficking, although Mexico is the big by leaps and bounds exporter of illegal narcotics to the United States, not Venezuela, under 5%, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. Now the U.S. wants to open up a new front and attack Nigeria for allegedly committing white genocide, although the United Nations and other international organizations are saying no such thing is happening. So the destabilization policy in the 21st century is a fixture in Western foreign policy. And it is a leverage that the West uses in its decline versus the ascendancy of the China-led BRICS group to contain and slow down the ascendancy of the other side. And the Ukraine war falls into this mold. Now, the crisis in Ukraine, which started almost 4 years ago, has had consequences for the globalization, the neoliberal globalization economy. it has resulted in the fragmentation, as the IMF and the World Bank and IMF World Bank economists have argued. It has resulted in this is another very important dimension in the fragmentation of the world economy. Neoliberalism entailed globalization, closer integration of the world economy. The war in Ukraine has entailed fragmentation because the US imposed and compelled the Europeans and the rest of the world doing business with Russia to impose sanctions, even on third parties. US imposed sanctions to essentially cut off Russia. This has nothing to do with Trump. It was during the Biden neoconservative foreign policy team. They thought they would go back and repeat the Reagan tactics of essentially weakening back then in the 1980s during the Mikhail Gorbachev era, of weakening Russia so much economically that Russia would come to its knees and bend to the wishes of the West. That hasn't worked. It has resulted, however, in exactly as the IMF and the World Bank and other economists and scholars have pointed out, it has resulted in a fragmented block trading economies. They still trade with each other, but at a higher cost to the mass consumer. This is why when I conclude, I will point out that the price for all of this has been paid primarily by the working class around the world and by the global south, the poorer countries, especially sub-Saharan African countries, and Putin, by the fact that he made special deals with African countries bilaterally, was essentially agreeing, yes, our war has caused problems for you, for your people. So that is a reality. That has been a reality as a result of this. Now, the beneficiaries on the other side of the equation have been, especially the defense companies. Let's face it, the United States and NATO have raised their defense spending in the last 4 years, during the period, in other words, almost 4 years of this war, have raised their defense budgets enormously. Trump compelled NATO to raise the percentage of GDP spending for defense from 3 to 5%. By the way, they were not spending 3, they were under that. But he raised it to 5. And Europe has gone along with this. Although Europe has suffered enormously in its civilian economy, and it shows even in the strongest economies, namely Germany, France, and England, the United Kingdom, all of them. Although that shows very clearly that the civilian economies of Europe have weakened, they still divert resources from the civilian economy to the defense sector to support that war up there in Ukraine. And all along, they were sending aid to Israel against the Palestinian people, by the way. A war that, again, just for the record, is genocide according to ICC, the International Criminal Court. Now, the NATO budget is estimated, it's higher than that, but it's estimated at least 1.7 trillion. US is just under a trillion, just the US defense budget. Now, what about the other side? There are wild figures given by some Western sources what the other side has been spending. Now, we have to separate when it comes to Russia, because Russia is at war. What it spends per day and what it has spent approximately per year for this war versus the regular defense budget. The regular defense budget is between 140 and 155 billion, somewhere in that neighborhood. When you combined Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, those 4 countries, the axis of evils countries, you combine their defense spending minus what Russia is spending for this war. That's a separate expenditure um, to execute the war. When you combine that and compare what the defense budget is of the NATO, US-led NATO group, it's about a fifth. So, in other words, NATO outspends the excess of evil 5 to 1. And yet, the threat comes from the other side. Um, this is um, this is what we have. The Russia war. This is not to, again. I want to make sure because I don't want to be misunderstood. This is not to say that this is an issue. I stated this at the outset of angels versus Satan on the other side, or vice versa. They are both engaged in a military conflict to determine the global balance of power with China-led BRICS group, where Russia is a key player, is a major player, with them arguing we want a multipolar, not a unipolar with the U.S. at the head, world power structure, balance of power structure, where there is a voice for sovereign nations commensurate with their economic power. Obviously, that benefits the BRICS group, with China, given its immense economic power. The United States is trying to prevent that. It's not in its interest. It wants to make sure that it maintains Pax Americana, the American peace, the American century of the 20th century, except that that's over. That's been over. And of course, it is. It's a new century. It's the Asian century. The 21st century is the Asian century. And the realization of that will eventually sink in as the nominal GDP of China forges ahead of the United States in a decade or two. Right now, in purchasing power parity, China is obviously way ahead of the United States. The the Europeans have not done very well, and yet they want a military solution to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. That is the European governments, not the European people. The European people, in public opinion polls, oppose this war, just like they oppose the war that Israel launched in Gaza. It is the governments representing business interests. And the question is, why are they doing this? If that is the case, why are they doing this? Isn't it better to stimulate the civilian economy? The civilian economy of Europe has been hurt very badly. The US has used the Ukrainian war from the very beginning, even before it erupted. The US was demanding disintegration, economic disintegration of Europe and Russia, and breaking the energy relationship, the energy link, supplying natural gas especially. This is why they destroyed Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 2 pipeline, supplying Germany from Russia. Just a few days ago, ExxonMobil signed a major U.S. Gas pipeline deal going through Greece to supply much of Europe, parts of Europe at least. Again, using the argument that, in fact, I believe it was not the U.S. ambassador, but the chairman and the CEO of ExxonMobil, who said, in the United States, we have a lot of natural gas. Why not sell it to Europe? Well, because it's costlier. It's very simple. Because the United States is on the other side of the Atlantic, and Russia is right next door to Europe, and it's much cheaper to buy natural gas and oil from the Russians. Now, there is another dimension to this and I'm gonna bring this up before I forget this. The In October 2020, 2025, it has to do with energy. The Trump administration, which was determined to bring peace to this region, between Ukraine and Russia, and in fact wanted the Nobel Prize before peace was struck. After never reaching an agreement in August 2025 in Alaska, where Putin and Trump met, in October, Trump decided to embrace the neocon assumptions about the forever war doctrine and announced, and sanctions, of course, the Democratic Party's, the Biden administration sanctions as a leverage against Russia. And so Trump announced major sanctions hitting two of Russia's oil giants, Lukoil and Rosneft, and anything to do with those companies by third parties. Mainly, they can't do anything about China, obviously, but namely India. And the question is, of course, what would India do? India was obviously making a lot of noise that it was unjustly punished because of these sanctions. Now, India historically, by the way, going back to the Nehru era, has been along, back then with an unaligned of Indonesia, Egypt, Yugoslavia. India was one of the uh, countries that led the non-aligned group, and the non-aligned basically were theoretically on neither side. India has tried to maintain this posture of saying, well, we want to be on the U.S. side. We want cordial relations with the United States and pursue trade benefits where they benefit us with the U.S. But we're also in the BRICS group after all, historically, as the Indian foreign minister under Modi has said, let's face it, Russia never did anything to harm us. So we have to continue cordial relations with Russia. So India has, in other words, it's not the only country trying to play this role on a world scale. Turkey, a major player in the Eastern Mediterranean, also tries to play both sides. Indonesia, to a large degree, has also in this group. Now, the Trump administration decided finally that to force India to make up its mind. It's either them or us. A dichotomous Cold War thinking, them or us, choose. India doesn't want to choose, obviously, because its interest is not to choose. Um, but this it goes to the heart of reshaping the world balance of power. And the Trump administration knows that India is the weak link in the BRICS. And if they break off India from the BRICS group and geopolitically link them to the West and put the pressure economically on them and give them in the mix some incentives, that would be a major victory to weaken China and then force them to make better terms at the negotiating table on the issue of Ukraine, right? Some sort of scenario along that way. Um, the fact is that India is competing with China. India is not. India is a major player. India is determined to forge ahead with its high growth, spectacularly high growth in comparison to other countries in the global south, by the way, spectacularly high growth GDP going forward, and to remain a leader. Doesn't want to yield to China when it comes to leadership in the global south. It wants to have that role for itself as well. And so it has been trying to weasel itself under a conservative neoliberal Modi, who is, in fact, closer to Trump but he's also close to Putin. Let's face it. These are both, all three of these leaders have a lot of things in common, by the way. Um, Now, Ukraine figures into this as an opportunity for countries to position themselves to see where they can have optimal benefits, depending where they, uh, how they, depending on the alignments that they strike up. Um, the war between Ukraine and Russia has, in fact, undermined um, the globalization, neoliberal economy, and it has strengthened blocks and solidified blocks. One of those blocks that it has strengthened is the US European bloc, with the US reverting back to the early Cold War era where the Europeans are subservient to the US geopolitically and geoeconomically. Europe has been trying to use the Ukraine war to assert geopolitical independence by raising its defense spending substantially. Japan, by the way, the same thing, because it's in the G7 and it's trying to do the same thing. Both, by the way, have failed, but that is theoretically the goal. They're also using, let me look at it this from an economics, from the putting on the glasses of an economist, but they're also looking at this. Well, if the civilian economy is lagging, maybe we can get some stimulus by um, through the war economy of Ukraine, and the aid they have provided. Like I said, enormous aid, just under half a trillion. It's probably more than that, but the figures will know eventually. Um, the um, uh, the U.S. has, in fact, weakened Europe by uh, forcing them to accept not just a subservient relationship. And as Trump perhaps inadvertently stated at one point in a brief press conference or one of these impromptu discussions with reporters, he said, "Let's say we have made money out of this war because the Europeans are buying weapons from us and they're giving them to Ukraine. Why would that be a bad thing?" So the military industrial complex in the United States remains very powerful. And in the process, granted, the US has huge problems in terms of its civilian economy, and serious scholars, economists, and even some serious businessmen that I've seen articles by them and investors on Wall Street are saying, look, this is not sustainable to continue to have two-thirds of the population suffering downward living standards and rising healthcare costs, rising housing costs. The median price of a house in the United States is close to $450,000. Now, I don't know what working person can afford that. This is the reason they have a Mamdani, Zoran Mamdani, the mayor in New York, who won to the shock of the far right wing. Oh, there's a communist in New York. No, he's a New Deal Democrat like FDR, like Franklin Roosevelt, Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, who came in and said this unchecked greed by businesses, by Wall Street, is what led to the Great Depression. The New Deal thinking is back in the United States, and it's not socialism and communism. That's nonsense. It's New Deal Keynesian economics, um, namely raise living standards for working people and the middle class to make sure that sociopolitical polarization is mitigated, goes down, not up. And that means that the government in Washington has to send in the National Guard and use the pretext of immigrants to occupy cities. You see, this is what the militarist police state, with adventures from Ukraine to Israel, starting new conflicts in Venezuela, in Nigeria, agitating in the South China Sea. This is what the cost is. Ultimately, the cost is that the people at the bottom pay for it. The people at the bottom. It is not idle rhetoric. When Trump says it, I don't know what it is, because he's right. I agree with him when he says people are getting killed, they're getting slaughtered in Ukraine, and he's absolutely right. But what is he doing about it? He said he would end the war, and he's not ending the war. Um, and the question is, what is the solution here? And the solution is certainly not a military solution, because a military solution would mean nuclear war. It's that simple. Russia will never accept a military defeat by Ukraine. It is, by the way, the Kremlin regards officially, this is not just propaganda. It really regards this war as a war between Russia. Behind it, of course, are a few allies, China, the main one, versus US led NATO. This is a war between East and West. This is not Ukraine. Ukraine, I repeat, I've said it several times, left to its own devices, is really a non-entity for Russia, a major military power. So the question is, where is this headed? A political solution is the only solution. All wars end with political solutions. Military solutions are the exception. There are military solutions like World War I, World War II, Vietnam War. There are military solutions, but in even those, at the end of those wars, the two sides sit down at the negotiating table and discuss what kind of a post-war balance of power at the regional level, and in this case, on the world scale, there would be. Doesn't matter what the war is, even if there is a military solution. Like I said, World War I, the peace treaty, the Paris Peace Treaty follows. The parties sat down, they made a mess of that, and that's why we had one of the reasons, not why, but one of the reasons we had World War II. But there has to be, these are political issues. War is just an extension of diplomacy, as has been said many times by many before. And so there has to be, the question is the terms of of the peace. What are the terms of the peace? Ukraine cannot be a threat to the Russian Federation. If it's a threat, the Russian Federation is dangerous to everybody. It's that simple. And even Henry Kissinger, as warmonger as he was, understood this. And he, at the end of the Cold War, he said, what we have to decide to the United States and to the Europeans is the limits we must place not on them, but on ourselves. What limits are we willing to put on ourselves so that we avoid conflict? The United States and NATO don't want to put limits. They have said that NATO must expand on a world scale. The actions of the so-called peace president are show that the conflicts, the two major conflicts, Israel and Ukraine, are ongoing. By the way, the Israelis have been continuing to hit Gaza. They've been continuing to they hit southern Lebanon, supposedly to weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon. They have been actively trying to make sure that the military solution that the Zionist state had all along prevails, and that no concessions are made to the Palestinians. That is a disaster scenario, and it's asking for trouble down the road, by the way. That's not what must happen in Ukraine, because in this case, this is unlike the one in Israel, which was a genocide war. This is a conventional war between Ukraine and Russia. And a conventional war requires serious negotiations and compromise on the weaker party. And the weaker party here is NATO, by the way. NATO has been weakened for a very simple reason. It will not realize its expansionist scheme through the Black Sea, Transcaucasus, and Central Asia. And the reason is because Russia and China, with their junior partners, Iran and North Korea, are not going to allow that. They're not going to allow the penetration of NATO in their backyard. That's not going to happen. And so they have to make the question is the 20% of the territory that Russia controls. By the way, 20% of the Ukrainian territory, roughly 20%. Russia controls right now. The question is, what is Russia willing to give up for that? And who's going to pay for reparations? The West says Russia is going to pay for reparations. Russia says, well, they have confiscated something like 350 billion of their money, perhaps more, and they've been supposedly giving some of that to Ukraine. Russia doesn't want to pay for that, and it wants its money back. So a compromise has to be reached on war reparations. There is a lot here where a political solution is crying out to settle this once and for all. And so the idea here is not to have a repeat of this down the road. Obviously, in 2014, there was a conflict. Russia took the Crimea. It annexed the Crimea. We don't want, this is 2025, we don't want in the mid 2030s a repeat of what happened here. 10 years ago, there was the Crimean annexation, 11 years ago. We don't want 10 years down the line another war. So the terms of peace, if anything, history has taught us from the Paris peace treaty ending World War I to the present, that the peace treaty is very important. What kind of peace treaty is struck? Again, I want to point out that the net beneficiaries of this war have been businesses on all sides, by the way. Indian companies have made a lot of money refining crude oil from Russia and reselling it, even to the US, by the way, and to the Europeans. Although there were sanctions, they were reselling that oil, that refined gasoline. So they made money, not Indian people, Indian companies, energy companies, Modi's allies. Chinese companies, both state-owned and private, may have made a lot of money through this. Major concessions, Russia yielding all that mineral wealth up there in Siberia, and of course that gas pipeline, now that good's going to go to China, to link China. Major benefit for both sides, by the way, but essentially it means reducing Russia to a Chinese economic satellite. Russia is going to play second fiddle to China, just like Europe plays to the US. I'm going to thank you for listening. Ask questions, write comments. By all means, I ask you to join this channel. Thank you very much. Thank you.